what I'm going to ask you guys to do is a little unorthodox because I have to put everything together and show you how it works and then break it and show you how it doesn't work. And that's a lot. So there's going to be a lot of graphs, and I'm going to go fast, and you're going to drink through a fire hose, and it's going to be fantastic. So here's the thing. Don't take notes. You're like, what? Don't take notes. Why? Because when you start drawing the graph, I'll be gone. Now, you're like, but what about? Here's the thing. If you want a copy of the PowerPoint, just ask me and I'll email it to you. Or better yet, you can go on the Mises website where my book is, and there is a free PowerPoint that goes with the book. So let's get started. Business cycles, okay, particularly the Austrian theory of the business cycle. So we need a framework. So what does an economy look like? Does it look like this? Or does it look like this? And if we look at the one on the right, you're like, well, what is that? That's Friedman's plucking model. And it's like, okay, so what's the current state of macroeconomics? Well, it starts with the quantity theory of money, MV equals PQ. Then you do a little calculus and you get that. And then what does that mean? It means this. Spending growth equals inflation plus real growth. And then we create a dynamic aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And this becomes the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model. But that's actually not a cycle model at all. The DSGE is not a business cycle theory. You see, what you have is a shock to the system. So you have a shock, and it's like throwing a rock into a pond, boom. But it doesn't have to be a negative shock. It could be a positive shock. Aww, isn't that nice? Like, that's great. Okay, but what's the cure, right? What's the cure? There's no such thing as a cycle when it comes to these sorts of models, right? All we have are Pareto-efficient responses to shocks, and any intervention is bad. This is a highly unsatisfying answer. So modern macroeconomic theory either gives us a bust and a return, or a boom and a return. And what's the modern cure? The best the central bank can do is move the aggregate demand curve. And this is assuming that it gets things right, and that's assuming a lot. And if the problem is a negative shock to aggregate supply, then there's no real solution. And what is a negative shock? No one knows. I went to talk to this Fed economist, and he gave this presentation. He was telling us about 2008. Like imagine you're a guy, the economy's a guy on a bicycle, and a car clips him and knocks him into a ditch. And so now we got to get the guy out of the ditch. Okay. That's our job. Where'd the car come from? Is there another car? Is it coming back? Are there lots of cars? Doesn't matter. They don't care. Not a cycle theory. So what we want is a model that answers some fundamental questions. There's three. What's the cause and the cure of a cycle? Why is there a cluster of errors that appear at this upper turning point? In other words, you've got these entrepreneurs, and they're paid to get things right. They're paid very handsomely when they get things right. And if the market is doing what markets do, those that are not any good at it, well, they lose their jobs and they go away. And those that are good at it stay. But why is it they all make the same mistake at roughly the same time in all the same direction? And why are there greater swings found in the earlier production stages and not so much when we get close to the consumers? Now, we need something systematic. What economic element touches the whole economy? And I can think of two things. The first one is money, right? Now, is that 100%? Close enough. It's 99 point whatever. Now, if we increase the money supply, what happens? Well, we get inflation. But, as we all know, money is not neutral, meaning what? That it changes real relationships. But what's the other thing that will affect the entire economy? Time. It takes time to produce things. And we see that time takes form in the rate of interest. The Austrian macroeconomic model incorporates both of these things. Now, before we can show how an economy fails, We need to see how it functions properly. And so we have to talk about economic growth. And this is Say's law, or what I like to call the magic formula for economic growth. So let's start at the end. What is the goal of an economy? Like, the economy is a bunch of diverse people who are heterogeneous, and there's no such thing. Fair enough. But if there was a goal of an economy, what would you say it is? I'd say, how about higher living standards? Okay, we want to be better off. Okay. Well, how do we get higher living standards? Now, I'm going to throw out some technical terms, okay? More stuff. Okay? Now, I am a trained economist, have a PhD, more stuff. Be careful when you use this. Okay? But how do we get more stuff? Well, we have to increase our productivity. Now, you could say, well, we could be like pirates and conquer. No, we're not going to go down the road of violence, but peacefully. How do we get more stuff? Increases in productivity. But how do we become more productive? Okay, how do we become more productive? Well, we need better tools, better machines, better equipment, and we call this capital accumulation. Now, where does capital come from? Well, capital comes from investment. But where does investment come from? Well, that comes from savings. So, savings leads to investment, which leads to capital accumulation, which leads to an increase in productivity, which leads to more stuff and higher living standards. Now, let me ask you this. Where's consumption in all of this? It's at the end, isn't it? It's why we're doing what we're doing. It's the reason why we go to work. Can we consume our way to prosperity? No, of course not, right? You see how that doesn't work. So Keynesianism, wrong right there. Bam. Mic drop. Now, of course, this is also called Say's law. Okay, so it was long before Keynes. And we can go through a whole thing in another session where we could talk about what Say said and what Keynes said, Say said, because what Keynes said, Say never actually said, see? Okay. So let's get to the business cycle. Now, from an Austrian point of view, when we look at a business cycle, we'll just use GDP over time. Why doesn't the economy just grow at a nice trend? Why doesn't it just grow? What's this thing about cycles, right? Why does it do this? And we can identify distinct phases of it, right? We can see that there is an expansion, and the Austrians blame that monetary expansion is the root of this, and it becomes unstable. It's followed by an upper turning point. That's where that cluster of errors takes place. It's then followed by a downturn, which we call the recession. And then hopefully there's a recovery. Now, does there have to be a recovery? There does not. Why? Because we can screw it up. That's why. Okay, no guarantee. So what we want to do is we want to build a model. And the model has three components. So we'll walk through them fairly quickly because these were covered in earlier talks. So the first one builds on the structure of production. And this is what the last talk was about. And you're like, that was so long ago. It was before lunch. Yes, Patrick Newman did a great job. Okay, so the structure of production. So what we do is we put time on the horizontal axis, and it's moving from left to right. We put value on the vertical axis. Now, do all Austrians do it like this? They do not. But Roger Garrison, back in 1990, first posited it like this for reasons. And you'll see why in a little way later. So now we have structure of production, so different stages. So suppose we're looking at a table or this podium here, this wood thing. So what do we have to do? We have to get the raw materials. We have to cut down the tree in the forest. We take it to the sawmill and we turn it into a table or into a podium. And then it goes to a wholesaler and then it goes to a retailer. Now, these are in a sequence. When we say that there's a structure to it, what we mean is that we have to cut down the tree first. I can't start with the wholesaler. That's no good, okay? I can't manufacture the table without the wood. Don't try it. It doesn't work, okay? So what we see here is that this is not clock time or calendar time. It's a sequence, okay? It's an ordering. This has to come before this, and this has to come before that. And so what we're saying is that the capital goods are heterogeneous and they complement each other, that there is a structure to it. If it was 100% substitutable, it could just be a blob, but it's not. It's complementary. Now, we see that the ultimate thing is consumer value, right? That's why we produce. That's why we go to work. And we also see that financial capital flows in the opposite direction. So let's take a look at how this is used. So we've got resources and labor, original factors of production. We have time on the horizontal axis, the third original factor production. Embedded at each stage is physical capital. And so that's when I was talking about tools, machines, and equipment. And the next type of capital is called intermediate capital or goods in process. And that's the wood being turned into a board, being turned into a table, and it goes to the wholesaler. And so that flows through the structure of production. And then we have financial capital coming back the other way. Now, tying this all together then are markets. Okay, markets. And we see that the demand originates with consumers, that when the Walmart then goes to the wholesaler of tables, their demand is derived from what the consumer's demand is. And when the wholesaler goes to the manufacturer and demands tables, their demand is derived from what Walmart wants, and then that's from the consumers. Now, going the opposite direction, you have the owners of natural resources, the owners of labor, and they have opportunity costs. And so that creates the supply curves. And so the supply curves are going up through the structure production, the demand curves are coming down the structure production, and it all integrates. And if you look at Salerno's talk earlier, where he talks about calculation, you get rid of private property, you get rid of opportunity costs, you have no supply curves, and the whole thing falls apart. Even if you keep all of the demand curves, you still don't have prices. Mises, mic drop. So how many stages are there? Well, in that last figure, we had 4 stages. However, in reality, there are uncountably many stages in production, and we can represent these many stages as a triangle. So here is what we call a Hayekian triangle. But you see that the different stages are still embedded in there. Now, Newman talked about roundaboutness, and roundaboutness is a clunky word. It's not great. However, it's sort of the best we have, and it's an essential concept in capital theory. So back in 1889, Eugen von Bombaverk argued that to increase production, capital structure would have to become more roundabout or more complex. Now, why would entrepreneurs make their production process more complex? And the answer is fairly straightforward. Make profit, right? That's why. So that might manifest itself in a faster assembly line, or higher quality products, or more diverse products, or any number of things. So we need to recognize that adding length for its own sake is counterproductive, because I don't want to just make things that take a long time to make or make them unnecessarily complex. What matters is that the structure of production and overall is efficient when it's in balance. So you say, well, what about the automobile manufacturers, right? Back in the day, they used drafting tables. Well, today they use computers, and that's a whole lot faster. So that shortens the structure of production, right? No, the structure of production is not about time, as in clock or calendar time, but it's the sequence. It's the number of steps or stages. So it's actually lengthening the structure of production, because who made the computers? Who wrote the software? What are all the steps in between? So we've added complexity to the production process, and we call that being more roundabout. So let's illustrate that, right? So we come back to our triangle with our 4 stages. And now I want to add design, right? And so this is lengthening the structure of production, okay? So that's the first component of our model. The second component of the model is our production possibility frontier curve. Now, if you've taken principles of economics, you see this in chapter 2. Now, I'm going to put consumer goods on the vertical axis and investment goods on the horizontal axis. What we see is that if I put everything I have into consumer goods, I get point A. Now, if I want some investment goods, I have to sacrifice 5 units of consumer goods, and I move to point B. But if I want another 20 units of investment goods, well, now I have to sacrifice even more consumer goods, and so on, right? Notice how it keeps increasing. So what we see is a concave production possibility frontier. Why? Because it's representing the law of increasing opportunity cost, or the same law, just from the opposite perspective, the law of diminishing marginal returns. Same law. Now, if we take a look at our production possibility frontier curve, what is point A? It's inside the production possibility frontier. So if I'm on the frontier, what does that mean? Well, on the frontier means that I am at full employment, but inside, what is that? We're in a recession. We're not at our potential, okay? But if I'm on the frontier, what does that mean? I'm at full employment. Now, can an economy go beyond full employment? And it kind of depends on your assumptions. Hayek, he said no, and he made his model so that it didn't work that way. But I prefer Garrison's interpretation in where you can go outside of it, and you can have an unstable point outside of the PPF. Now, what if I want to show growth? Oh, and that point A1 shows the amount of consumption and investment. But what if I want to show growth? Well, I'm shifting out the entire production possibility frontier. Maybe it's at point A2. And at point A2, I have more consumption and investment goods. Okay, so this is the second component of our model. The third component is our loanable funds market, where the interest rate is found. So I'm going to put quantity of loanable funds on the horizontal axis and the interest rate on the vertical axis. So we have the demand curve, which is borrowers, and the supply curve, which is savers. This is all based on time preference, right? They come together, there's their interest rate. I have quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. S equals I, which is what? Savings equals investment. And so both supply and demand are based on time preference, as Professor Herbner was talking about. So we see that in the demand curve, we have people who need money now for investment, but then again, we have borrowers with options. On the supply side, we have people who are natural savers, and we have people who love to spend. Now, let's put it all together. So what I'm going to do, and this is based on the work of Roger Garrison, he was my dissertation chair, and he takes the loanable funds market and puts it in the lower right-hand quadrant. He takes the production possibility frontier curve and he puts it just above it, and the structure production to the left, and watch how they link together. So we see the intersection of the supply and demand for loanable funds creates an interest rate. It gives us a certain amount of savings and investment. That investment goods pops up onto the production possibility frontier. If we're at full employment, we just bounce off of that to the amount of consumer goods, and that links up to the structure production. Okay? Now, let's play with the model a little bit. So, suppose that people become more patient. What? In this society? Yeah, I know. But let's just assume this, right? We can do that. I've got 3 questions. How does this change affect the model? What happens to consumption and savings decisions? And how do investors and entrepreneurs react? Well, let's come to our model. We start in equilibrium, and now we're going to posit that people become more patient. What happens? Well, we're going to see that savers are going to save more. Why? Well, because they're more patient, right? We shift out the supply curve. So what happens? We see that interest rates fall, the amount saved and invested increases, and now what happens? Well, let's take a look at the production possibility frontier. Watch what happens to point A. You see that? It's still on the frontier, okay? Are we in full employment? Yes, still in full employment. What happens to the amount of consumption goods? It's gone down. If you're a Keynesian, you're freaking out. Now, let's see what happens in the structure production. And this is what Patrick Newman was showing us in his last lecture. Now, let's zoom in on the structure of production, okay? So when the structure of production becomes more roundabout, and you can see it shifting out like that, what happens in these micro markets, okay? So on the right-hand side, your right-hand side, I have late-stage goods, and then on the left we have early-stage goods. Now watch what happens in these respective markets. These react differently. If all of capital and all of production is a homogeneous blob, you miss this. Some areas of the economy are going to boom and other areas are going to contract, right? Think of a forest. The tree dies and then that becomes the fertilizer and the nutrients for new growth, right? So you need some companies to go under to free up resources, and they get shifted into other areas of the economy. Now, each factor market moves differently. And what do other schools of economic thought think about this? They don't. They ignore it. But now let's add growth into this, okay? Let's add growth into this. So we start with people becoming more patient. So we see an increase in the supply. We see that interest rates fall, and we move along the production possibility frontier. We then see that we start to build out this capital structure, more roundabout production processes. But that leads to what? More productivity. We're expanding the frontier. And when we expand the frontier, we see that new businesses are formed, right? So see what happens down here in the loanable funds market. Right? Now, does the interest rate have to go back to where it started? It does not, but just to keep the graph kind of clean, because it's kind of messy already, right? I put it right back there. So we see that supply and investment have increased. So if investment or savings and investment have increased, so if investment has increased, what happens to consumption? And we see what happens to the structure of production. But notice that it moves in a very lumpy fashion. See my structured production curve moving there? Yeah, it's lumpy. It's not this easy, whoop, we're there, okay? Now, that's the first scenario. Scenario 2. Let's suppose that the government places a price ceiling on interest rates. My same 3 questions. How does change affect the model? What happens to consumption savings decisions? How do investors and entrepreneurs react? Okay, so we place a price ceiling. Notice that we have what? There's a separation between savings and investment. It's quantity supplied and quantity demanded. Whenever you place a price ceiling below equilibrium, you get a shortage. But this is not any normal shortage, it's a credit shortage. So this is the amount available, savings, and the amount that entrepreneurs want. So which one is going to go up to the production possibility frontier curve? Not how much we wish we had, but what we actually have. And so notice what happens to the production possibility frontier. It swings the other way, right? It swings counterclockwise. Did you see that? And what happens to the structure of production? It shortens, okay? It shortens. Then we have all the micro markets affecting. Now we're going to take scenario 1 and scenario 2, and those are going to be all the building blocks for scenario 3, which is the business cycle. So the Austrian view of the business cycle is 5 components. It starts with artificial credit expansion, that followed by a malinvestment boom, an upper turning point, this crunch, and it's going to manifest as either a credit crunch or a real resource crunch. It's typically both, but one comes before the other. Then we'll have a recession or a liquidation phase, and hopefully, we get a recovery. Now, let's do a thought experiment. Suppose you're an entrepreneur. The prevailing interest rate is 6%, just like it was in 2001, and your company is considering a project that's going to yield a 4% rate of return. Are you going to do it? No, you're not stupid. Of course not. I want the 6, not the 4. But suppose that the central bank lowers interest rates from 6% down to 1%, just like it did in 2003. Now what are you going to do? I don't want 1%, I want the 4, right? So what we have is an unsustainable boom. So notice what starts the process. The new money is injected in the loanable funds markets. It does what? It lowers the interest rate. Now, before, when I placed that price ceiling there wasn't enough savings. But now, because we've added money into the system, it's available to be borrowed. And so now we see that there's an expansion of investment goods. And notice what happens to the structure of production, right? They're building the more roundabout processes. But at the same time, has anyone changed their time preference? Did you become more patient? No, no one has. So what's happened to savings? With a lower interest rate, you cut back on savings, and now you're going to consume more. And if you're going to consume more, what does that do to us in the production possibility frontier? We are outside the PPF. We're at an unsustainable point. And notice what happens to the structure production. We have what is called a dueling structure production. John Cochrane, who passed away a few years ago, came up with this idea. But do you see how this is unstable? We are not in equilibrium. This cannot last. This is an artificial boom. It is unsustainable. What if you were an entrepreneur and you were building houses? You have enough bricks to build 4 houses. Can you start 6 foundations? Can you start 6 foundations? You can. See, that's the problem. As firms compete for resources, input prices are driven up, making them look for more funding. I'm running out of bricks. So what do I want? I need more funding. I need to borrow more. That $100,000 that I borrowed is not enough, so I have to borrow more. What does that do to interest rates? People are scrambling for funds. Short-term rates are going up more than long-term rates. And so I'm going to give a yield curve talk later on as the advanced session, but I'll give you a taste here. The yield curve has 3 components. We have time preference, an inflation risk, and a liquidity preference. And put that all together and take out default risk, and we get something called a yield curve. So if I'm scrambling for funds, I'm going to be borrowing just so I can finish the darn house. Because if I don't sell the house, I get nothing. My company is dead. So I got to get the funds, I got to get the bricks, I got to finish the house, I got to make a sale. So I'm scrambling for short-term funds. And so the yield curve is going to invert. And this becomes a really good forecasting tool. So notice the black yield curve. If I take the long end on the right and I subtract out the short end, I get a positive number. If I take the red one, I get a negative number. So take a look at this data here. That thick line in the middle going across is 0. Every time the numbers go down below that, it's inverted. And you'll see that the yellow lines are the recessions. So it's inversion, recession, inversion, recession, inversion, inversion, recession, 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 inversion. Do a little bit closer. It's from 2000. And a little bit closer from 2014. And what you'll see is that the recession hits just as we're uninverting the yield curve. So are we due? Maybe. But the central bank has a decision to make. They either halt the expansion, and the result is a credit crunch, or, and this is because of inflation, or they expand the money supply at a faster rate in order to avoid the real resource crunch due to economic sluggishness. But the result is a real resource crunch, meaning we run out of bricks. When the crisis hits, there are 2 problems facing the entrepreneur. We have increasing interest rates and rising input costs. And the rising input costs are more devastating to the businesses. So the story centers on how the central bank distorted the intertemporal price, the thing that connects today with tomorrow, and we call that the interest rate. The entrepreneurs have made these errors all at the same time, all in the same direction. Why? Because they were lied to. The signal was falsified. That's all they have to go by. They're just entrepreneurs. An increase in the interest rate impacts both working capital and fixed capital. The longer lived the capital equipment, the greater the impact on the value, and projects with longer time horizons will also see larger swings in net present value. So here comes the recession. Ready for it? Now, notice where it falls to. Notice where it falls to. Where does it fall to? I see that it's a C and an I, but that's not the key. What's the key here? It's inside, true. But why does it stop there and doesn't just keep on going? What's the cushion? What's the safety net? It's savings. See where S1 is down in the loanable funds market? That's where it falls to. Now, what happens in the structure production? Right? It collapses. Do we see bigger swings in the earlier stages of production? Yeah. These guys get wiped out. It's devastating. And so without these businesses, what happens to the demand curve? Demand curve falls. Why? Because they're out of business. There's no more demand for these loanable funds. And people lose their jobs. And so they don't save as much. Now, do we have to go back to that original interest rate? No. But I put it there just because, it cleans it up a little bit. Now, this is where Murray Rothbard's America's Great Depression kind of ends, right? This new equilibrium, right? We start with we get to that upper turning point, and then he says, there's the downturn. And then the book ends. You're like, oh, well, it's not much of a cycle theory, is it? Well, it is, but not enough attention has really been paid to the recovery process. Okay, the liquidation and recovery process. So let's go through the liquidation side. So what is the liquidation phase? This is where businesses fail. Remember, the free market is about profit and loss. Everyone thinks about profit. Loss is a necessary part of a market. It's essential. Now, it sucks. Nobody likes it. It's like going to the dentist and hearing right? Nobody likes that sound. But it's necessary. You talk to any other school of thought, they're like, oh, we can avoid recessions. Oh, we can manipulate the money supply so that never a recession will ever hit us again. The Austrians say, look, it sucks, but it's a necessary component for recovery, because if we don't go through the liquidation process, we end up like Japan in the 90s and have this economy that just drags on with anemic growth. We look at the 2008 crash, right? 2007, 2009, and we never snapped back. We started growing at 1.2%, and under Obama, and they're like, wow, this is fantastic, we're growing again. But we never recovered and then started growing. We just kind of bottomed out and then just kind of kept going. That's not good. So yeah, we can mess it up. We can perpetuate a depression, right? If we look at the 1920-21 recession, it was over in 18 months. It was deeper than the initial shock in 1929. Why? What's the difference? Because Herbert Hoover, Republican, and then FDR, Democrat, made all of the wrong choices. Well, who was president in 1920? No, not Harding. It was Woodrow Wilson. There was an election in 1920, but Harding was not president until March of 1921. Oh, yeah. So how did Woodrow Wilson fix this? Well, what happened? Well, they had a massive deficit. They were spending, something like 18 million, and the amount of revenue coming in was 5 million. Right? Now, the million with an M, not trillions, right? So a little different than today. So what happened? Well, in 1918, the Republicans took over Congress, and when the recession hit, they cut spending. They cut it down to 6 million and they kept spend revenues at 6 million. They balanced the budget. They didn't cut taxes, they cut spending. Now, why didn't progressive Woodrow Wilson do anything about it? Well, because he had a stroke and he was drooling in his pillow. That's why. So he did nothing. And they are out of a recession that was deeper than the 1929 because they cut back. They got government out of the private sector and got out of the way. And in 18 months, they went back. Now, if you are an employee and you lose your job, it sucks for 18 months, but can you live on maybe savings and friends and family for 18 months? Yes, absolutely. But what if it's 10-year Great Depression? No one can do that. So, the liquidation phase. Only through the process of converting the malinvestments into productive capital can the foundation for growth be achieved. The firms that invested during that malinvestment boom are going to suffer the economic losses. They sell their capital equipment at a discounted rate to other firms. And these other firms can then turn an economic profit at the previous prices because these firms have purchased the capital equipment at a discount. So, suppose GM was truly allowed to go bankrupt in 2009. Not bailed out like they did with Obama, but actually go bankrupt. What would they do? They'd have to sell everything, right? Is there any value in Corvette? Yeah. How about value in Cadillac? Absolutely. So they would sell it to who? I don't know, Elon Musk, Lexus, BMW, Mercedes, someone. And these buyers, would they have to pay top dollar to get Cadillac? No, pennies on the dollar. It's a liquidation sale, going out of business sale. What does that mean then? The new buyer could buy those machines, turn those very same machines on, make the very same car, sell that very same car at the very same price, but now because they have a lower cost structure, remember they bought it pennies on a dollar, they're making a profit where old General Motors could not. That's how you turn a recession into a recovery. You need the liquidation process. The liquidation process is how malinvestments are converted into new fixed capital equipment. This process is necessary for normal economic growth. Now, what's the cure? There is no cure. There's no avoidance, right? Once you start down that path, you need to clear out the malinvestment. But we can make the bad less bad, okay? Like what? Stop inflating. Get off the sauce, man. Now, when we say inflate, I don't mean it in the normal, the standard way, the modern way. I mean it in the classical way. What is inflation? Well, today, it's what? You take the average price level and you compare it over time. But averages are risky, right? I could have one hand in a bucket of ice water and another hand in a bucket of fire. And on average, I'm fine. Oh. The old classical definition of inflation is think of a balloon, right? I am blowing air into the balloon. What am I doing? I'm inflating the balloon. So the classical definition of inflation is an increase in the money supply. The classical definition is the cause. The modern definition is the effect. Okay? So when I say stop inflating, I mean the classical definition of inflation. We need to make bankruptcy process easier. All this paperwork, all the lawyers, it's too much. If you make it quick, fast, expedite it. We need to make mergers and acquisitions easier. And what was the thing that saved us when the economy was collapsing? What was the safety net, that cushion? Savings. So what do we need to do? We need to increase savings. All of the things that we are doing in our economy is about boosting consumption. Think about it, right? You have income, and then I'm going to take a portion of that income, and I'm either going to save it or I'm going to consume it. If it's all about boosting consumption, what are we not doing? Saving. But I'm not just talking about individuals, because what is savings? Savings is deferred consumption. Do others other than you and me save? Absolutely. A huge portion of savings are corporations. what do? They make a profit. And some of that profit they give to shareholders. Those are called dividends. But the rest of it are what we call retained earnings. Retained earnings are a form of savings. They are deferred consumption. It's what's plowed back into the company. So yeah, do I want to give a tax cut to corporations? Of course, because corporations aren't real people anyway. Only real people bear the burden of a tax, but that's a whole separate thing. Anyway, so what's the recovery? The recovery is the same process as normal growth. In other words, the magic formula for economic growth. Savings leads to investment, which leads to capital accumulation, which leads to higher productivity, more stuff, and higher living standards. Okay? That's how we do it. Okay? Now, this is my book that I came out with last September, and they sell it downstairs. I do not make a dime from it, but I do think that you might want a copy. And so, if you go to that website there, you scan the QR code, you can get a free PDF. Next to that is a free PowerPoint of a lot of these things that I just talked about. But there is one other advantage of actually getting it from the bookstore, and that's I have a pen, and I can sign it. Yeah? Yeah. Now they're like, yeah, I can spend a whole $9, right? And that's my email address. So if you have any questions, and now I meet a lot of students, right? Just tell me where we met. Oh, is that Mises U 2025? And I'll be like, yeah, the only Mises U I lectured at. But so far, right? But just tell me where we met and such, and then I answer all of the questions that come in. Okay? So I think I have 1 minute for a question, but maybe not. I'll tell you what, if you have questions, I know you have questions, but I'll tell you, we'll just break now, and we'll come back in 17 minutes, and then if you have questions, I'll just be over here, okay? Thank you.